Hi everybody, it's Mark Myers, the Family Woodworker. Hey, this week we're going to do a project that's a little necessary, and I'll explain why in a second. So back in my younger days, I played pickup basketball, I played indoor volleyball, a lot of crashing on the ground on my knees, and I also had a couple of jobs in light construction and swimming pool installation where I was constantly on my knees, moving rocks, digging clay, pushing dirt. And over time, that just beats the crap out of your knees. And anybody who's getting up there in years that used to be pretty active like that in sport, a lot of start, stop, a lot of left, right, push off, chances are you're having some fun like I am with my knees. So I've already had my right knee taken care of, and it was great, fantastic surgery. But while I was going through rehab, I built my own cane. Now, I did it out of necessity, and I did it quickly, and I was looking for something unique. I didn't want to buy. Most of the ones at the store were pretty short. I'm relatively tall. So I made something that was sized appropriately, and I used a hockey stick as my base. Good and strong, easy to put a rubber cap on the end, and I put a couple of pieces of oak on the handle, and that took care of my big enough grip where it stabilized myself while I was going through rehab and getting used to walking again. It's kind of funny because as they fix your knee, the angle of your leg changes back to straight, and it feels funny when you walk for a while. So I tell you that story to tell you this story. I'm going to get my left knee taken care of now, and I thought since I'm getting a little better in terms of collecting tools and woodworking, and I'm collecting some specialty woods that are going to be great for a project like this, I'm going to make my own cane, and I'm going to class it up a little bit nicer than an old hockey stick. So stick around, we'll put one together. So I started with some of the hardwoods that I had already in stock, and I had some thin walnut that was about 7/8 of an inch. I had some ipe, which was 1.5 inches, but it wasn't very long, and I really liked the look of this wenge, which was about 1 7/8 inches, but I would have had to put two pieces together to make the cane length. And I really dug how the zebra wood would act as a shaft on the cane. But trouble started right away. Now, this was an expensive piece of zebra wood, and when I cut into it, I could actually hear it tick apart as if the grain of the wood was cracking. In fact, you can see at the very end a crack actually just open way up. Now, when I cut this thing down to 1 inch by 1 inch, it was a little bit over like 1 1/16 by 1 1/16. Look at that crack open up on that piece of wood. It was really unstable, and this is where I just said, forget it. I just gave up on the zebra wood idea. I thought it would look great, but it turned out to be a major pain in the butt. So I had some walnut, and I didn't want to use it. It was relatively thick. It was more than 1.5 inches thick, but I wound up cutting a piece off of that and then cutting it down into, again, just like about 1 1/16 by 1 1/16 square to give me a working shaft for the cane. And then all I did was turn my blade on 45 degrees, and I took the square edges off this thing because my lathe is a mini lathe. There's no way I could put this shaft on a lathe. I'm going to have to hand finish this and turn it into a round as close to a dowel as I can for the cane. So there it is. All the 45s are cut off, and it's just a nice little octagon. You know, and honestly, it looked pretty good the way it is. I could have used this as a shaft of a cane, but I wanted to round it off. So without the lathe, I've got to do some hand tooling on this, and one of the things that I wind up using my little tiny workbench for is I'll block it like I've done here on one end of my bench, and then my bench vise is actually set up to be about 1/2 inch higher than the height of my tabletop, and that allows me to clamp pieces in like this and to work the wood with hand tools. So what I did is then for each one of those edges on the 45s, I actually went in with a hand plane and I just started to take those edges off. It's not, going to be completely round when I'm done with it, but it's going to take a lot of that material out of there and get it. When you look at it from a distance, when I was done with this process, it actually looked pretty round. and it actually made nice piles of shavings. Or should I say, happy piles of walnut shavings. They smell great too. So there's a couple things you can do. You could probably do this by hand. You could probably set up the shaft on your bench vise and just kind of go over it with just a palm sander and kind of knock those high spots down, knock those edges down further. But this seemed to work out really well for me. In fact, I've seen other woodworkers use a belt sander like that to smooth it down, and that actually worked pretty well. It got me close to hand sanding. So for the handle, I had some thicker Padauk, and I like the idea of the red handle matching or offsetting against that walnut shaft. So I put a couple of pieces together, got them cut, got them sanded down for glue up, and I matched the grain so that I positioned the pieces so that when you look at it from the top and after you get done sanding it and cutting it down, it'll look pretty close to being a single piece of wood. So that's something you can play with too. And again, just play with the pieces until you get the grain to line up and you'll get your best outcome. So once again, the video, what I'm trying to show here too is that this is a project that you can do with basic tools. You didn't need to have the belt sander. You don't need to have fancy tools. I think if you could find yourself a piece of wood that you can cut, the table saw definitely helps when you're cutting the shaft down. But everything else is a lot of handwork. So at this point, I'm just trying to organically draw a handle. And I cut the Padauk big enough so that you can see me putting it in my hand a couple of times. I wanted it to be big enough to support my hand, the width of my hand. And I was just looking for something that was just organically curved and looked pretty good. And at this point, even if your pencil lines aren't that great, you make everything nice and smooth and symmetrical while you're sanding it. So I chose to mark this out first before I drilled my hole. So in order to attach the two pieces, I'm not actually going to take the shaft and drive it into the handle. I wanted the width of my handle to match the width of the shaft, which means I'm going to have to come up with a fastener between the two pieces. And I happen to have in stock 5/8 of an inch thick dowel rods in hickory. So I wound up drilling a hole then in the handle that was 5/8 of an inch thick to take that dowel. And hickory is pretty tough stuff too. It's a good, strong hardwood, and that would make a great dowel rod. But I didn't want to use a thin one, so that 5/8 of an inch thick hickory dowel is actually going to take up a lot of space inside the handle and also in the shaft. Now at this point, I'm just cutting it out roughly on the bandsaw. And again, you could use just your palm sander with some 60 grit sandpaper to take this down, and that's what I was doing here. And I had the benefit of this old belt sander, so I'm just taking the edges off, I'm rounding it over, trying to eliminate as much hand sanding as possible. Now, this is a trick that I had to use in order to get that hole centered on the shaft. Now, I have the ability to turn the head of my drill press off to the side, but how do you drill it straight? So I set up the shaft on my hold block, and then I used a regular level to make sure that my shaft was plumb straight up and down, and then that allowed me to drill that straight hole down the shaft at that 5/8 of an inch thickness. So here's that hickory dowel. In fact, I show you the cut, but I had to trim this down once again. I cut the first dowel a little bit too long. And I also noticed inside the hole that was drilled in the handle and also the shaft, there was just enough play with the dowel inside that I wasn't going to have a problem clamping it up. In other words, it allowed the epoxy to squeeze out so that I could get a good, it completely surrounded the dowel rod. Now at this point also I'm trying to save myself some sanding, so I used a round over bit on my router just to take those edges off the handle. And now we're just going to get ready to glue it up. And I put epoxy in the shaft. Again, I'm using my 1/2 of a pair of chopsticks to help me with the glue. One of my favorite little shop tools. And then we'll get this long clamped up. I didn't need a lot of pressure to clamp this. You could have just used bungee cord to hold it together. And now for the dusting. So here's another shop tip. I wind up using 3M scouring pads, which was those blue scrubby pads that you saw at the beginning. And I'll roll a couple of those together, and then I can put the sandpaper over the top of that, and it makes a nice soft way to get into the nooks and crannies, work around the curves. Anytime you push it down on the wood surface, it forms to the wood surface.
And so after 3 coats of poly, it should protect it against the elements pretty well. It came out pretty nice. So I really like how the red-handled Padauk matched up with the walnut shaft. And I hate to say I'm looking forward to using it, because that's not a true statement. But it will look pretty nice when I need it as I'm going through rehab. So hey, thanks for watching.